Hi everyone. Welcome. It is Sunday, April 5th, 2020. And I hope everyone is safe and well at home. I want to show you something. I'm going to step out of here just a second. This morning, I went to. Well, this morning I was able to get some handkerchiefs that I had ordered to make a mask, and using the method that was suggested yesterday, and I did it. I can tell you there is not a rubber band anywhere in Orlando since this mask strategy has come out. But I had some tie straps that I have used for hoses in my car, and I was able to get them out of the glove compartment, extra ones, and use them for this purpose. So cool air conditioning in the car and safe from coronavirus, or safer anyway, not totally safe, but safer, using these straps and a common everyday handkerchief, which we should all be able to get, or something similar. I hope you're all doing this. It's so important. Oh, and everyone's saying hi. Hi, everyone. Hi. And I hope you're all having a decent day. It's sort of a cloudy, damp day here in Florida, in Central Florida. And I don't know what it's like around the rest of the country, but I hope everyone is safe and well this afternoon. Today, we are going to read two chapters, and I think actually this first chapter perhaps is the longest chapter in the book, in Farmer Boy, called Keeping House. Did I do it? No, hang on. There. Called Keeping House. So we'll start there. And this is a wonderful chapter because, and we've all been through this when we were kids. You know, when it sort of falls under that broad category, or that broad statement, when the cat's away, the mouse will play. And that's sort of what this chapter is all about. So let's start in right now. And I get to the end of this chapter, which in my book is like over 40 pages. We'll see if we want to go on to the next chapter. But this is Keeping House. Uncle Andrew lived 10 miles away. And by the way, as I start this, we know that we left off with Mother and Father announcing that they were going to go on vacation for a week to Uncle Andrew. So this is the day that Mother and Father are departing on vacation. Okay. Uncle Andrew lived 10 miles away. For a week, Father and Mother were getting ready to go. And all the time they were thinking of things that must be done while they're away. Even when Mother was climbing into the buggy, she was talking. "Be sure to gather the eggs every night," she said. "And I depend on you, Eliza Jane, to take care of the churning. Don't salt the butter too much. Pack it in the small tub and be sure to cover it. Remember not to pick the beans and peas I'm saving for seed. Now, you all be good while we're gone." She was tucking her hoops down between the seat and the dashboard. Father spread the lap robe. "And mind, Eliza Jane, be careful of fires. Don't you leave the house while there's a fire in the cook stove, and don't get to scuffling with lighted candles, whatever you do, and..." Father tightened the reins, and the horses started. "And don't eat all the sugar," Mother called back. The buggy turned into the road. The horses began to trot, rapidly taking Father and Mother away. In a little while, the sound of the buggy wheels ceased. Father and Mother were gone. Nobody said anything. Even Eliza Jane looked a little scared. The house and the barns and the fields seemed very big and empty. For a whole week, Father and Mother would be 10 miles away. Suddenly, Almanzo threw his hat into the air and yelled. Alice hugged herself and cried. What do we do first? They could do anything they liked. There was nobody to stop them. We'll do the dishes and make the beds, Eliza Jane said, bossy. Let's make ice cream, Royal shouted. Eliza Jane loved ice cream. She hesitated and said, well, Almanzo ran after Royal to the ice house. They dug a block of ice out of the sawdust and put it in the grain sack. They laid out the sack on the back porch and pounded it with hatchets till the ice was crushed. Alice came out to watch them while she whipped egg whites on a platter. She beat them with a fork till they were too stiff to slip when she tilted the platter. Eliza Jane measured milk and cream and dipped up sugar from the barrel in the pantry. It was not common maple sugar, but white sugar bought from the store. Mother used it only when company came. Eliza Jane dipped 6 cupfuls. Then she smoothed the sugar that was left. You could hardly have missed any. She made a big milk pail full of yellow custard. They set the pail in a tub and packed the snowy crushed ice around it with salt, and they covered it all with a blanket. Every few minutes they took off the blanket and uncovered the pail and stirred the freezing ice cream. I wonder how many of you have ever made ice cream with a hand crank ice cream freezer. Any? Good. Bill Graff, I've made ice cream with a crank and my arm nearly fell off, he says. This is a family tradition in my family. Every summer, 4th of July, we make homemade ice cream, 3 gallons of it. Everyone takes turns cranking. We have a banana ice cream recipe, which is traditional. That is absolutely like automatic. That must be made. Then there's a combination that mixes up of strawberry ice cream, fresh strawberry ice cream, which is amazing. Some combination of just decadent chocolate ice cream that's got every conceivable kind of chocolate in it. And then I have a great aunt who loves to make a peppermint ice cream, which I don't care for particularly, but she loves it, so we make it. And we do like 3 gallons of this, and everyone takes turns cranking, and you put in the ice and the rock salt, and you put the crank down, and it starts easy, and you keep cranking about until it gets so stiff that you can't turn it. And it's always the big guys at the end that are turning it, and when they can't turn it anymore, it's done. They're not doing it this way. There's no cranking involved. They're just letting it freeze in the tub. But I bet it tastes better. I sort of feel like it always tastes better when you crank it yourself, when you actually have worked to crank it, and it's amazing. Richest ice cream you'll ever eat. I'm going to continue now. When their ice cream was frozen, Alice brought saucers and spoons, and Almanzo brought out a cake and a butcher knife. He cut enormous pieces of cake, while Eliza Jane heaped the saucers. They could eat all the ice cream and cake they wanted to. No one would stop them. At noon, they had eaten the whole cake and almost all the ice cream. Eliza Jane said it was time to get dinner, but the others said they didn't want any dinner. Almanzo said, "All I want is a watermelon." Alice jumped up. "Goody! Let's go get one!" "Alice," Eliza Jane cried, "you come back here and do the breakfast dishes." "I will," Alice called out, "when I get back." Alice and Almanzo went into the hot melon field where the melons lay round above their wilting flat leaves. Almanzo snapped his finger against the green rinds and listened. When a melon sounded ripe, it was ripe. And when it sounded green, it was green. But when Almanzo said a melon sounded ripe, Alice thought it sounded green. There wasn't really any way to know, though Alice was sure he knew more about melons than any girl. So in the end, they picked 6 of the biggest melons, and they lugged them one by one to the ice house and put them on the damp, cold sawdust. Then Alice went to the house to do the dishes. Almanzo said he wasn't going to do anything. Maybe he'd go swimming. But as soon as Alice was out of sight, he skipped through the barns and stole into the pasture where the colts were. The pasture was big, and the sun was very hot. The air shimmered and wavered with heat. The little insects made a shrill sound. Bess and Beauty were lying down in the shade of a tree, and their little colts stood near them, waggling their small bushy tails and straddling a little on their long gangly legs. The yearlings and the 2-year-olds and the 3-year-olds were grazing. All of them lifted their heads and stared at Almanzo. He went slowly toward them, holding out his hand. There wasn't anything in his hand, but they didn't know that. He didn't mean to do anything. He only wanted to get near enough to pet them. Starlight and the other little colt ran wobbling to their mothers, and Bess and Beauty lifted their heads and looked, then laid them down again. The big colts all pricked up their ears. One big colt stepped toward Almanzo, then another. The 6 big colts were all coming. Almanzo wished he had brought carrots for them. They were so beautiful and free and big, tossing their manes and showing the whites of their eyes. The sunshine glistened on their strong arched necks and on the muscles of their chests. Then suddenly, one of them said, whoosh! You know that sound that horses make? I think that's what she's trying to write here. It's sort of a high-pitched whoosh. One of them kicked, one of them squealed, and all at once their heads went up, their tails went up, and their hoofs thundered on the ground. All their brown haunches and high black tails were turned to Almanzo. Like a thundering whirlwind, those 6 colts went around the tree, and Almanzo heard them behind him. He whirled around. He saw their pounding hoofs and big chests coming straight at him. They were running too fast to stop. There wasn't time to get out of the way. Almanzo's eyes shut. He yelled, "Whoa!" I should close my eyes. Whoa! The air and the ground shook. His eyes opened. He saw brown knees rising in the air. A round belly and hind legs rushed overhead. Brown sides went by him like thunder. His hat flew off. He felt stunned. One of the 3-year-olds had jumped over him. The colts were thundering down across the pasture, and Almanzo saw Royal coming. "Leave those colts be!" Royal shouted. He came up and said that for a cent he'd give Almanzo a licking he'd remember. "You know better than to fool with those colts," Royal said. He took Almanzo by the ear. Almanzo trotted, but his ear was pulled all the way to the barns, and he said he hadn't done anything. Royal wouldn't listen. Let me catch you in that pasture again, and I'll whale the hide off you," Royal said, "and I'll tell Father, too." Almanzo went away, rubbing his ear. He went down to the trout river and swam in the swimming hole till he felt better, but he thought it just wasn't fair that he was the youngest in the family. That afternoon, the melons were cold, and Almanzo carried them to the grass under the balsam tree in the yard. Royal stuck a butcher knife into the dewy green rinds, and every melon was so ripe that the rinds cracked open. Almanzo and Alice and Eliza Jane and Royal bit deep into the juicy, cold slices, and they ate until they could eat no more. Almanzo pinched the sleek black seeds, popping them at Eliza Jane till she made him quit. Then he slowly ate the last slice of melon, and he said, "I'm going to fetch Lucy to eat up the rinds." "You will do no such thing," Eliza Jane said. "The idea! A dirty old pig in the front yard." "She is not either a dirty old pig," said Almanzo. "Lucy's a little young, clean pig. And pigs are the cleanest animals there are. You ought to see the way Lucy keeps her bed clean and turns it and airs it and makes it up every day. Horses won't do that, nor cows, nor sheep, nor anything. Pigs, I guess I know that. I guess I know as much about pigs as you do," Eliza Jane said. "Then don't you call Lucy dirty. She's just as clean as you be." "Well, Mother told you to obey me, Eliza Jane answered, and I'm not going to waste melon rinds on any pig. I'm going to make watermelon rind preserves. I guess they're as much my rinds as they are yours, Almanzo began, but Royal got up and said, come on, Manzo, it's chore time. Almanzo said no more, but when chores were done, he let Lucy out of her pen. The little pig was as white as a lamb, and she liked Almanzo. Her little curled tail quirked whenever she saw him. She followed him to the house, grunting happily, and she squealed for him at the door till Eliza Jane said she couldn't hear herself think. After supper, Almanzo took a plate of scraps and fed them to Lucy. He sat on the back steps and scratched her prickly back. Pigs enjoy that. In the kitchen, Eliza Jane and Royal were arguing about candy. Royal wanted some, but Eliza Jane said that candy pulls were only for winter evenings. Royal said he didn't see why candy wouldn't be just as good in the summer. Almanzo thought so too, and went in and sided with Royal. Alice said she knew how to make candy. Eliza Jane wouldn't do it, but Alice mixed sugar and molasses and water and boiled them. Then she poured the candy on buttered platters and set it on the porch to cool. They rolled up their sleeves and buttered their hands, ready to pull it. And Eliza Jane buttered her hands too. All the time, Lucy was squealing for Almanzo. He went out to see if the candy was cool enough, and he thought his little pig should have some. The candy was cool. No one was watching. So he took a big wad of the soft brown candy and dropped it over the edge of the porch into Lucy's wide open mouth. Here's a picture of that. Almanzo dropping a big piece of candy into Lucy's mouth. Then they all pulled candy. They pulled it into long strands and doubled the strands and pulled again. Every time they doubled it, they took a bite. It was very sticky. It stuck to their teeth and their fingers and their faces. Somehow it got in their hair and stuck there. It should have become hard and brittle, but it didn't. They pulled and they pulled. Still, it was soft and sticky. Long past bedtime, they gave up and went to bed. Next morning, when Almanzo started to do chores, Lucy was standing in the yard. Her tail hung limp and her head hung low. She did not squeal when she saw him. She shook her head sadly and wrinkled her nose. Where her white teeth should have been, there was a smooth brown streak. Lucy's teeth were stuck together with candy. She could not eat, she could not drink, she could not even squeal, she could not grunt. But when she saw Almanzo coming, she ran. Almanzo yelled for Royal. They chased Lucy all around the house, under the snowball bushes and the lilacs. They chased her all over the garden. Lucy whirled and dodged and ducked and ran like anything. All the time she didn't make a sound. She couldn't. Her mouth was full of candy. She ran between Royal's legs and upset him. Almanzo almost grabbed her and went sprawling on his nose. She tore through the peas and squashed the ripe tomatoes and uprooted the green round cabbages. Eliza Jane kept telling Royal and Almanzo to catch her. Alice ran after her. At last they cornered her. She dashed around Alice's skirts. Almanzo fell on her and grabbed. She kicked and tore a long hole down the front of his blouse. Almanzo held her down. Alice held her kicking hind legs. Royal pried her mouth open and scraped out the candy. Then how Lucy squealed. She squealed all the squeals that she had not been able to squeal all night, and all the squeals she couldn't squeal while they were chasing her, and she ran screaming to her pen. Almanzo James Wilder, just look at yourself, Eliza Jane scolded. He couldn't and he didn't want to. Even Alice was horrified because he'd wasted candy on a pig. And his blouse was ruined. It could be patched, but the patch would show. I don't care, Almanzo said. He was glad it was a whole week before Mother would know. That day, they made ice cream again, and they ate the last cake. Alice said she knew how to make pound cake. She said she'd make one, and then she was going to sit in the parlor. Almanzo thought that wouldn't be any fun. But Eliza Jane said, "You'll do no such thing, Alice. You'll do no such thing. You know very well the parlor's just for company." It was not Eliza Jane's parlor, and Mother said she hadn't said she couldn't sit in it. Almanzo thought that Alice could sit in the parlor if she wanted to. That afternoon, he came into the kitchen to see if the pound cake was done. Alice was taking it out of the oven. It smelled so good, and he broke a little piece off the corner, and then Alice cut a slice to hide the broken place, and then they ate 2 more slices with the last of the ice cream. "I can make more ice cream," Alice said. Eliza Jane was upstairs, and Almanzo said, "Let's go in the parlor." They tiptoed in without making a sound. The light was dim because the blinds were down, but the parlor was beautiful. The wallpaper was white and gold, and the carpet was of Mother's best weaving, almost too fine to step on. The center table was marble-topped, and it held a tall parlor lamp, all white and gold china and pink-painted roses. Beside it lay the photograph album with covers of red velvet and mother of pearl. All around the walls stood solemn horsehair chairs, and George Washington's picture looked sternly from its frame between the windows. Alice hitched up her hoops behind and sat on the sofa. The slippery hair cloth slid her right off onto the floor. She didn't dare laugh out loud for fear Eliza Jane would hear. She sat on the sofa again and slid off again. Then Almanzo slid off the chair. When company came and they had to sit in the parlor, they kept themselves on the slippery chairs by pushing their toes against the floor, but now they could let go and slide. They slid off the sofa and the chairs till Alice was giggling so hard they didn't dare slide anymore. Then they looked at the shells and the coral and the little china figures on the whatnot, and they didn't touch anything. They looked till they heard Eliza Jane coming downstairs. Then they ran tiptoe out of the parlor and shut the door without a sound. Eliza Jane didn't catch them. It seemed that week would go on forever, but suddenly it was gone. One morning at breakfast, Eliza Jane said, "Father and Mother will be here tomorrow." They all stopped eating. The garden had not been weeded. The peas and beans had not been picked, so the vines were ripening too soon. The hen house had not been whitewashed. "This house is a sight," Eliza Jane said, "and we must churn today. But what am I going to tell Mother? The sugar is all gone." Nobody ate any more. They looked into the sugar barrel, and they could see the bottom of it. Only Alice tried to be cheerful. "Well, we must hope for the best," she said, like Mother. "There's some sugar left. Mother said don't eat all the sugar, and we didn't. There's some around the edges." This was only the beginning of that awful day. They all went to work as hard as they could. Royal and Almanzo hoed the garden. They whitewashed the hen house. They cleaned the cows' stalls and swept the south barn floor. The girls were sweeping and scrubbing in the house. Eliza Jane made Almanzo churn till the butter came, and then her hands flew while she washed and salted it and packed it in the tub. There was only bread and butter and jam for dinner, though Almanzo was starved. "Now, Almanzo, you polish the heater," Eliza Jane said. He hated to polish stoves, but he hoped Eliza Jane would not tell that he had wasted candy on his pig. He went to work with the stove blacking and the brush, and Eliza Jane was hurrying and nagging. "Be careful you don't spill the polish," she said, busily dusting. Almanzo guessed he knew enough not to spill stove polish, but he didn't say anything. "Use less water, Almanzo, and mercy, rub harder than that." He didn't say anything. Eliza Jane went into the parlor to dust it. She called, "Almanzo, that stove done now?" "No," said Almanzo. "Goodness, don't dawdle so." Almanzo muttered, "Whose boss are you?" Eliza Jane asked, "What's that you say?" "Nothing," Almanzo said. Eliza Jane came to the door. "You did so say something." Almanzo straightened up and shouted, "I say, whose boss are you?" Eliza Jane gasped. Then she cried out, "You just wait, Almanzo James Wilder. You just wait till I tell Mud." Almanzo didn't mean to throw the blacking brush. It flew right out of his hand. It sailed past Eliza Jane's head. Smack! It hit the parlor wall. A great splash and smear of blacking appeared on the white and gold wallpaper. Alice screamed. Almanzo turned around and ran all the way to the barn. He climbed into the haymow and crawled far back in the hay. He did not cry, but he would have cried if he hadn't been almost 10 years old. Mother would come home and find he had ruined her beautiful parlor. Father would take him into the woodshed and whip him with the black snake whip. He didn't ever want to come out of the haymow. He wished he could stay there forever. After a long while, Royal came into the haymow and called him. He crawled out of the hay, and he saw that Royal knew. "Manny, you'll get an awful whipping," Royal said. Royal was sorry, but he couldn't do anything. They both knew that Almanzo deserved whipping, and there was no way to keep Father from knowing it. So Almanzo said, "I don't care." He helped do the chores, and he ate supper. He wasn't hungry, but he ate to show Eliza Jane that he didn't care. Then he went to bed. The parlor door was shut, but he knew how the black splotch looked on the white and gold wall. Next day, Father and Mother came driving into the yard. Almanzo had to go out and meet them with the others. Alice whispered to him, "Don't feel bad. Maybe they won't care." But she looked anxious too. Father said cheerfully, "Well, here we are. Been getting along all right?" "Yes, Father," Royal answered. Almanzo didn't go help unhitch the driving horses. He stayed in the house. Mother hurried about, looking at everything while she untied her bonnet strings. "I declare, Eliza Jane and Alice," she said, "you kept the house as well as I'd have done myself." "Mother," Alice said in a small voice. "Mother?" "Well, child, what is it?" "Mother," Alice said bravely, "you told us not to eat all the sugar. Mother, we ate almost all of it." Mother laughed. "You've all been so good," she said. "I won't scold you about the sugar." She did not know that the black splotch was on the parlor wall. The parlor door was shut. She did not know it that day nor all the next day. Almanzo could hardly choke down his food at meal times, and Mother looked worried. She took him to the pantry and made him swallow a big spoonful of horrible black medicine she made of roots and herbs. He did not want her to know about the black splotch, and yet he wished she did know. When the worst of it was over, he could stop dreading it. That second evening, he heard a buggy driving into the yard. Mr. and Mrs. Webb were in it. Father and Mother went out to meet them, and in a minute they all came into the dining room. Almanzo heard Mother saying, "Come right into the parlor." He couldn't move. He could not speak. This was worse than anything he had thought of. Mother was so proud of her beautiful parlor. She was so proud of keeping it always nice. She didn't know he'd ruined it. And now she was taking company in. They would see that big black splotch on the wall. That's sort of a tongue twister. Big black splotch on the wall. Mother opened the parlor door and went in. Mrs. Webb went in, and Mr. Webb and Father. Almanzo saw only their backs, but he heard the window shades going up. He saw that the parlor was full of light. It seemed to him a long time before anybody said anything, and then Mother said, "Take this big chair, Mr. Webb, and make yourself comfortable. Sit right here on the sofa, Mrs. Webb." Almanzo couldn't believe his ears. Mrs. Webb said, "You have such a beautiful parlor. I declare it's almost too fine to sit in." Well, now Almanzo could see where the blacking brush had hit the wall, and he could not believe his eyes. The wallpaper was pure white and gold. There was no black splotch. Mother caught sight of him and said, "Come in, Almanzo." Almanzo went in. He sat straight on the haircloth chair and pushed his toes against the floor to keep from sliding off. Father and Mother were telling all about the visit to Uncle Andrew's. There was no black splotch anywhere on the wall. Here they are, gathered in the parlor, and there's no black splotch on the wall. "Didn't you worry leaving the children alone here and you so far away?" Mrs. Webb asked. "No," Mother said proudly. "I knew the children would take care of everything as well as if James and I were home." Almanzo minded his manners and didn't say a word. Next day, when no one was looking, he stole into the parlor. He looked carefully at the place where the black splotch had been, and the wallpaper was patched. The patch had been cut out carefully around the gold scrolls, and the pattern was fitted perfectly, and the edge of the patch scraped so thin that he could hardly find them. He waited till he could speak to Eliza Jane alone, and then he asked, "Eliza Jane, did you patch the parlor wallpaper for me?" "Yes," she said. "I got the scraps of wallpaper that were saved in the attic and cut out the patch and put it on with flour paste." Almanzo said gruffly, "I'm sorry I threw that brush at you. Honest, I didn't mean to, Eliza Jane." "I guess I was aggravating," she said, "but I didn't mean to be. You're the only little brother I've got." Almanzo had never known before how much he liked Eliza Jane. They never told about the black splotch on the parlor wall, and Mother never knew. I love that. I just love that story. You never know who loves you until a moment of crisis, and that you find out who really cares about you. And Almanzo learned a little lesson that day about his sister. Pretty great. This next chapter, called Early Harvest. Now it was haying time. Father brought out the scythes, and Almanzo turned the grindstone with one hand and poured a little stream of water on it with the other hand, while Father held the steel edges delicately against the whirling stone. The water kept the scythes from getting, oh, I'm saying that right, scythes. Scythes? Is it scythes? Someone say yes or no if they know. Scythes or scythes? I'm not saying, maybe the comments haven't caught up here, but scythes, maybe. I'm thinking SCY, scythe. Sorry about that. I'm going to go with scythe. The water kept the sides from getting too hot, while the stone ground the edges thin and sharp. Then Almanzo went through the woods to the little French cabins and told French Joe and Lazy John to come to work next morning. As soon as the sun dried the dew on the meadows, Father and John and Joe began cutting the hay. They walked side by side, swinging their scythes into the tall grass. Scythes or scythes? I'm just not sure, guys. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Into the tall grass, and the plumed Timothy fell in great swaths. Swish, swish, swish. Scythe. Okay, good. Thank you. While Almanzo and Pierre and Louis followed behind, spreading out the heavy swaths with pitchforks so that they would dry evenly in the sunshine. The stubble was soft and cool under their bare feet. Birds flew up before the mowers. Now and then a rabbit jumped and bounded away. High up in the air, the meadowlark sang. The sun grew hotter. The smell of the hay grew stronger and sweeter. Then waves of heat began to come up from the ground. Almanzo's brown arms burned browner, and the sweat trickled on his forehead. The men stopped to put green leaves in the crowns of their hats, and so did the boys. And for a little while, the leaves were cool on top of their heads. In the middle of the morning, Mother blew the dinner horn. Almanzo knew what that meant. He stuck his pitchfork into the ground and went running and skipping down across the meadows to the house. Mother met him on the back porch with a milk pail brimming full of cold eggnog. Now, the eggnog was made of milk and cream with plenty of eggs and sugar. Its foamy top was freckled with spices, and pieces of ice floated in it. The sides of the pail were misty with cold. Almanzo trudged slowly toward the hayfield with the heavy pail and the dipper. He thought to himself that the pail was too full. He might spill some of the eggnog. Mother said waste was sinful. He was sure it would be sinful to waste a drop of that eggnog. He should do something to save it. So he set down the pail, and he dipped the dipper full, and he drank. The cold eggnog slid smoothly down his throat and made him feel cool inside. When he reached the hayfield, everyone stopped work. They stood in the shade of an oak and pushed back their hats and passed the dipper from hand to hand till all the eggnog was gone. Almanzo drank his full share. The breeze seemed cool now, and Lazy John said, wiping the foam from his mustache, "Ah, that puts heart into a man." Now the men whetted their scythes, making the whetstones ring gaily on the steel blades, and they went back to work with a will. Father always maintained that a man could do more work in his 12 hours if he had a rest and all the eggnog he could drink morning and afternoon. They all worked in the hayfield as long as there was light enough to see what they were doing, and the chores were done by lantern light. These people worked so hard. It's just incredible the hours they spent doing what they were doing. We just have no conception of that. Most of us have no conception of that kind of work. Next morning, the swaths had dried, and the boys raked them into windrows with big light wooden rakes that Father had made. Then Joe and John went on cutting hay, and Pierre and Louis spread the swaths behind them, but Almanzo worked on the hay rack. Father drove it up from the barns, and Father and Royal pitched the windrows into it while Almanzo trampled them down. Back and forth he ran on the sweet-smelling hay, packing it down as fast as Father and Royal pitched it into the rack. When the rack would hold no more, he was high in the air, on top of the load. There he lay on his stomach and kicked up his heels while Father drove down to the big barn. The load of hay barely squeezed under the top of the tall doorway. and it was a long slide to the ground. Father and Royal pitched the hay into the haymow, while Almanzo took the water jug to the well. He pumped, then jumped, and caught the gushing cold water in his hand and drank. He carried the water to Father and Royal, and he filled the jug again. Then he rode back in the empty hay rack and trampled down another load. Almanzo liked haying time. From dawn till long after dark every day he was busy, always doing different things. It was like play, and morning and afternoon there was cold eggnog. But after 3 weeks of making hay, all the haymows were crammed to bursting and the meadows were bare. And then the rush of harvest time came. The oats were ripe, standing thick and tall and yellow. The wheat was golden, darker than the oats. The beans were ripe, and pumpkins and carrots and turnips and potatoes were ready to gather. There was no rest and no play for anyone now. They all worked from candlelight to candlelight. Mother and the girls were making cucumber pickles, green tomato pickles, and watermelon rind pickles. They were drying corn and apples and making preserves. Everything must be saved, nothing wasted of all the summer's bounty. Even the apple cores were saved for making vinegar, and a bundle of oat straw was soaking in a tub on the back porch. Whenever Mother had 1 minute to spare, she braided an inch or two of oat straw braid for making next summer's hats. The oats were not cut with scythes, but with cradles. The cradles had blades like scythes, but they also had long wooden teeth that caught the cut stalks and held them. When they had cut enough for a bundle, Joe and John slid the stalks off in neat piles. Father and Royal and Almanzo followed behind, binding them into sheaves. Almanzo had never bound oats before. Father showed him how to knot 2 handfuls of stalks into a long band, then how to gather up an armful of grain, pull the band tightly around the middle, twist its ends together, and tuck them in tightly. In a little while, he could bind a sheaf pretty well, but not very fast. Father and Royal could bind oats as fast as the reapers cut them. Just before sunset, the reapers stopped reaping, and they all began shocking the sheaves. All the cut oats must be shocked before dark because they would spoil if they lay on the ground in the dew overnight. Almanzo could shock oats as well as anybody. He stood 10 sheaves up on their stem ends, close together, with all the heads of grain upward. Then he set 2 more sheaves on top and spread out their stems to make a roof over the 10 sheaves. The shocks looked like little Indian wigwams dotted all over the field of pale stubble. Here's a picture of what they're doing. The Garth Williams illustrations and all the books. Now, these are obviously what Garth Williams did for what most of us grew up with. Were sort of pencil drawings, is what the etchings of these. And they've been colorized. I don't know that Garth Williams did it. I could be wrong on that, and someone's going to know the answer to that. But I love these drawings. I'll just leave it at that and not get into trouble saying whether he colored them or someone else did. I didn't say that. The wheat field was waiting. There was no time to lose. As soon as all the oats were in the shock, everyone hurried to cut and bind and shock the wheat. It was harder to handle because it was heavier than the oats, but Almanzo manfully did his best. It's funny. Then there was the field of oats and Canada peas. The pea vines were tangled all through the oats, so they could not be shocked. Almanzo raked them into long windrows. Already it was high time to pull the navy beans. Alice had to help with them. Father hauled the bean stakes to the field and set them up, driving them into the ground with a maul. Then Father and Royal hauled the shocked grain to the barns while Almanzo and Alice pulled the beans. First, they laid rocks all around the bean stakes to keep the beans off the ground. Then they pulled their beans. With both hands, they pulled till their hands could hold no more. They carried the beans to the stakes and laid the roots against them, spreading the long vines out on the rocks. Layer after layer of beans they piled around each stake. The roots were bigger than the vines, so the pile grew higher and higher in the middle. The tangled vines, full of rattling pea pods, hung down all around. When the roots were piled to the tops of the stakes, Almanzo and Alice laid vines over the top, making a little roof to shed rain. Then that bean stake was done, and they began another one. The stakes were as tall as Almanzo, and the vines stood out around them like Alice's hoop skirts. One day, when Almanzo and Alice came to dinner, the butter buyer was there. He came every year from New York City. He wore fine city clothes with a gold watch and chain, and he drove a good team. Everybody liked the butter buyer, and dinner time was exciting when he was there. He brought all the news of politics and fashion and prices in New York City. After dinner, Almanzo went back to work, but Alice stayed to watch Mother sell butter. The butter buyer went down cellar. It's interesting the way they say this, went down cellar. I would want to say the butter buyer went down to the cellar or down into the cellar, but Laura just simply writes, the butter buyer went down cellar, where the butter tub stood covered with clean white cloths. Mother took off the cloths, and the butter buyer pushed his long steel butter tester down through the butter to the bottom of the tub. The butter tester was hollow, with a slit in one side. When he pulled it out, there was a slit with a long sample of butter. Mother did not do any bargaining at all. She said proudly, "My butter speaks for itself." Not one sample from all her tubs had a streak in it. From top to bottom of every tub, Mother's butter was all the same golden, firm, sweet butter. Almanzo saw the butter buyer drive away, and Alice came skipping to the bean field, swinging her sunbonnet by its strings. She called out, "Guess what he did?" "What?" Almanzo asked. "He said Mother's butter is the best butter he ever saw anywhere, and he paid her. Guess what he paid her? 50 cents a pound." Almanzo was amazed. He'd never heard of such a price for butter. "She had 500 pounds, Alice said. "That's $250. He paid her all that money, and she's hitching up right now to take it to the bank." In a little while, Mother drove away in her second best bonnet and her black bombazine. Bombazine. That's another word that I'm not familiar with, but I looked it up. For those of you who have not heard that term, I'm sure a lot of the ladies are familiar with the term bombazine. I'm just completely not familiar with that term. Now, it was described two ways. One, as a kind of cloth with the way it was woven. But then in the description that went further, it described a collarless woman's outfit that had a jacket, or the bodice as it's called, and a long skirt. So she was driving away in her second best bonnet and her black bombazine. She was going to town in the afternoon on a weekday in harvest time. She had never done such a thing before, but Father was busy in the fields and she would not keep all that money in the house overnight. Almanzo was proud. His mother was probably the best butter maker in the whole of New York State. People in New York City would eat it and say to one another how good it was and wonder who made it. How great. Isn't it great to feel proud of your mother? That's the end of that chapter. That was a long read, everybody. I'm just looking at some of the comments here. Anyway, that's. I'm sorry. I'm distracted. I'm reading the chapters or the comments that are coming up. And thank you for all your nice comments. And it's fun to read them when this is all over with. That's our 2 chapters for today. Those were 2. That's pretty long. It's a pretty long 2-chapter read. That's maybe the longest one we've done. Perfect for a Sunday when everyone's home every day right now. But nice for a Sunday when you can sit and relax and listen to the story. Love doing this. I hope you all have a nice evening. Be back tomorrow to continue reading 2 more chapters starting at 1:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, right here on Allison Arngren's Facebook page. So cool that Allison is doing this. And Allison and I are going to be on Newsmax on the 9th at some point during the day, if it all stays, but that's the plan, to talk about what we're doing, reading the Little House books to all of you. And I think that's pretty cool. And, there's so many people around the country now, and all over the world for that matter, doing things like this to stay connected to people. And it's really important. And I'm so delighted that Allison and I can do this with you. And there will be other members of our cast in the weeks ahead who will be coming to read to you as well. So it's going to be a fun. As long as you're trapped at home, you may as well have some fun listening to Little House books. I'll see you tomorrow, or I'll be talking to you tomorrow. Have a good evening, and be well, safe. Wash your hands as always, and wear your masks. See you tomorrow. Bye.